everybody, welcome back. Thanks for coming back to my channel. I'm Alexis. So in the last video, we talked about where the origins of cognitive functions came from, where Myers and Briggs came from, and some of Carl Jung's work. So today what I wanted to do was to bridge the gap between the two. How does Myers and Briggs connect to cognitive functions and hopefully make it a little bit more accessible to you so you can see what cognitive functions your personality has. So let's go ahead and connect these two. Basically, the deal is that MBTI, Myers-Briggs type indicator. Myers-Briggs is just a code. So when Myers and Briggs came on the scene, they didn't add a whole lot to Carl Jung's work, but what they did was make it a little more accessible to the general public. At the same time, it's now lost some of its value because people only see the code and they've kind of taken it to be these 4-letter dichotomies, which wasn't really Carl Jung's intention, but it did make it a little bit more accessible, certainly to the general public. So you may have noticed in the last video, we had ways to take in information, so intuition and sensing. And you might realize that's the second letter in your Myers-Briggs code. And then we have ways to make decisions, to make judgments, and that's with thinking or feeling. And that's the third letter in your Myers-Briggs code. And then they were also introverted and extroverted, so you can see where the I comes into play. So you might be asking, okay, so I see introvert, extrovert, and S, TF. What does the JP, where does that come into play? I didn't see anything about that. So what does the JP difference have to come, where does that come into play? So basically what it comes down to is it's just a code. Myers-Briggs took the 8 cognitive functions and they made a 4-letter code so that it would be faster to say, basically the name of your personality. So basically each person has 4 functions. They have a dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, inferior. And I basically just start at the top left, works my way around clockwise to get there. So basically, if you're an extrovert, then you have your extroverted function dominant. If you're an introvert, you have your introverted function dominant. This might not make sense. Bear with me for a second. If you're a J, you extrovert your judging function, your decision-making function, remember the thinking and feeling. And if you're a P, you extrovert your perceiving function. That's another way to say your learning function, the way you take information. So that's your sensing and intuition function. So I want to go ahead and get into an example of basically what this looks like, because this basically is I don't really understand what this means. So let's just take an example. Okay, so let's say you're an INFJ. So what I'm going to start with, okay, so if you're an INFJ, so they're a J, and they also are an introvert, okay? So that's part of the code, that's what we're looking at. So if you're a J, you extrovert your judging function. So judging is another way to say decision-making function. So they extrovert, in their case, their feeling function. So that shows they're going to have extroverted feeling. They're focused toward the group's feelings and, the morale and diplomacy and things like that. And so the opposite will be, what I didn't write on the slide is, so if you're a J, you extrovert your judging function and you just are going to automatically introvert that second letter. So we're really only dealing with those middle 2 letters here. So if you're a J, you extrovert your third letter. If you're a P, you would extrovert your second letter. So now going over on the left-hand side of the screen, I's have their introverted function dominant. So their introverted function is NI, introverted intuition. That's going to be their dominant function. And so this gives us everything we need for the code. So we'll do a few examples of this. So if this is feeling like you're getting a little lost, no worries. We will definitely do a few examples of these. So their dominant function is NI, introverted intuition, and their auxiliary function is FE. So that's how INFJs work. But they might be saying, well, where does this tertiary inferior come in? And I thought these were on an axis. So this is exactly how it's going to work. If you remember from the last video, NI is on an axis. The opposite of N is S. The opposite of I is E. So they have an inferior function of extroverted sensing. And then the opposite of FE, so the opposite of F is T, and the opposite of E is I. So you've got all 4 of their functions filled in. So this is basically what the INFJ's mind looks like. And we'll go into in later videos how these functions look when they're in the dominant slot or the auxiliary slot, tertiary, or inferior. But we'll do a few more examples. So basically for an INFJ, their dominant function is introverted intuition. Their auxiliary function is extroverted feeling. Their tertiary function is introverted thinking. And their inferior function is extroverted sensing. Okay, so now we're going to try this again with the INFP. So you'll notice we only changed 1 letter. So they're both INFs. We just did the INFJ. Now we're going to do the INFP. So what we'll do is, so this person is a P, so they are going to extrovert their perceiving function, their learning function, the way they take in information. Remember, that's with our second letter. You're either an N or you're an S, and that's how you take in information. So they're going to extrovert their second letter, and then just by opposite, they'll introvert their third letter. Always working with the second and third letters. And since this person is an introvert, their introverted function is the dominant. So this person they have introverted feeling as their dominant, and then we have the extroverted intuition as their auxiliary. But then we can't forget these are always on an axis, so we have to include their opposites right below them. So the opposite of extroverted intuition would be introverted sensing, and the opposite of introverted feeling would be extroverted thinking. So for the INFP, they've got inner feelings dominant, then they've got extroverted intuition as their auxiliary, then they've got introverted sensing as tertiary, and extroverted thinking as inferior. And once again, in the next video, we'll talk about like exactly how these come into play. Okay, nice. Let's try another one. Let's try the ENTP. So this is a P. So they're going to extrovert their perceiving function. So that means they'll introvert their judging function, their decision-making function. And since they are an extrovert, the extroverted one is their dominant function. So they've got NE as their dominant, and they've got TI as their auxiliary. So we just plopped those in right there. Then we can't forget about their opposites on their axis. So the opposite of thinking is feeling. The opposite of introvert is extrovert. The opposite of N is S. And the opposite of E is I. So those would be the cognitive functions for an ENTP. Okay, and finally, let's go on to our last example. This is the ENTJ. So we only switched one letter from the last one, but it is going to make their personality drastically different just by changing that one last letter. So they're a J, so they're going to extrovert their judging function, which means they're going to introvert their perceiving function or their learning function. And since they're an extrovert, that extroverted function is going to go dominant, and their introverted function is going to go auxiliary. So their dominant function is extroverted thinking, and their auxiliary function is introverted intuition. Then we're going to take into account their axes. So the opposite of N is S, the opposite of I is E, the opposite of T is F, and the opposite of E is I. So we have kind of their axes like that. So what Myers and Briggs did was fairly helpful. So instead of saying I'm an extroverted thinking, introverted intuition person, I mean, that's the way you would say it, now you can say I'm an ENTJ. So there's far more to it than the letter dichotomies, but it is helpful for being able to say I'm an ENTJ. You know, it is a fast shortcut, and you can kind of code it and work your way backward to figure out what cognitive functions you're using. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to talk about what each location specifically means. So what does it mean if you have a function in the dominant slot versus the inferior slot or the tertiary spot? So because, you know, each spot has its own strengths and its own weaknesses. So just because you have extroverted thinking in the dominant spot, you use it very differently than someone who has it in the inferior spot or the tertiary spot. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next video. So now you've seen what all the cognitive functions are. You've seen which ones your personality has. So now what we're really going to get into is the development, the growth part, which is the really fun part about, you know, using these tools. So then you can really see what your blind spots are, what your strengths are. And for me, that's the biggest use of Myers-Briggs. Some people feel like it's a box that you get put into, and it definitely can be that way if you're not using it for growth. What I've loved it the most for is blind spots. So I have strengths that I didn't realize I had. They were blind spots. I have weaknesses that I didn't realize that I had, and they were blind spots. And so it's been really illuminating and a good conversation starter to, you know, talk with my husband or friends that they're saying this in the description. Do you think that? And they're like, yeah. And I was completely surprised, completely unaware that was even a trait that I had. So we're going to use this for growth. And so hopefully in the next video, it'll be really helpful so you can see, you know, how you use it and where you use it. Thanks, guys. Bye.